So hello everyone and welcome to today's panel, The Power of Mind-Friendly Communities, which is brought to you by the Rick Hansen Foundation. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're from, and joining us across Canada today. My name is Jonathan Marriott and I'm the Director of Partnerships at Access Now, and I'm going to be your host and moderator for the next hour. I'm a very proud member of the neurodivergent community and my pronouns are he and him. I'm a white 41-year-old male with dark blonde hair and I'm wearing a dark blue polo shirt today. I've also got my Sustainable Development Goals pin from the United Nations. I may speak to you in a strong English accent, but I'm very, very proud to call Canada my home. Before we begin, I would like to share my gratitude for the privilege of living and working in Canada and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. As your host, I'm joining you today from Oakville, Ontario. This is located on the treaty lands and Treaty of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. As an uninvited guest, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land. I'm just going to pause for a moment of reflection for all of us. Yesterday marked the start of National Accessibility Week, a week to celebrate the valuable contributions and leaderships of Canadians with disabilities. It's also a time to reflect on how we can become better, more inclusive, and more accessible across Canada. Our discussion today is going to focus on the importance of creating mind-friendly communities and how all of us can contribute to creating a welcoming environment for folks who are neurodivergent, a subject which is near and dear to my own heart. Along with my fellow panelists, I know what it's like to encounter barriers that have limited my participation or simply having to justify why I might be doing something differently. I may not have been able to spell my middle name until I was 14, which is true, but my brain is a whirlwind of interconnected ideas, and it doesn't always follow the conventional thought patterns, but it's constantly buzzing with energy, seeking out new connections and possibilities. I do have a daily challenge to kind of harness this boundless energy and focus on specific tasks, but it's a source of immense creativity, and it's a unique way of seeing the world, and I wouldn't change it. A few years ago, I used to say that this was my superpower, but it started to give me the real ick. And to be honest, the real reason why I was saying that was to justify to others who were in the room that I was okay to be there. The number of times that I've self-declared only to be met with a, "Oh, good for you, dear." And I once actually had someone pat me on the arm and say, "Well done." And I was like, well, for what? Coming to work, showing up? However, from the other perspective, I also know what it's like to be part of inclusive environments that allow us to be our best self. On behalf of the Rick Hansen Foundation, I want to welcome our panelists, Melanie, Ethan, Lara, and Bushra, and thank you for sharing your stories and insights with everyone today. Today is about having an open and honest conversation, and I encourage everyone to share their authentic experiences. And it's just a reminder that sometimes this can be uncomfortable for people to hear, but it's important to learn about new perspectives for us to grow. Before I pass it over to the panelists, I would like to just remind very quickly of the logistics. As I said before, all attendees have their mics turned off. Closed captions is available by the CC button. You can also use the caption settings to increase your size. If you can't locate the link and prefer to view the captions in a separate window, send us a message in the Q&A and someone's going to reach out to you. We also have ASL interpretation today. The chat function has been turned off. This event is being recorded and a link to recordings will be sent out afterwards. As a friendly reminder to all of our panelists, we have a live captioner today, and this is a reminder to myself. So sometimes we'll just take a pause to allow the ASL interpreter to catch up and do the interpreting. In addition, please use the raise hand function when wanting to add into the conversation. So the next hour is action-packed, and without further ado, I'd like to start with some introductions. So now I would like to hand over to Melanie.
Hey, Jonathan. I'm Melanie Green. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an HR consultant and accessibility specialist with the government of New Brunswick, where I lead transformative accessibility projects. Currently, we're working a lot with wayfinding, and we collaborate with organizations like Accessibility Standards Canada, as well as the Rick Hansen Foundation, to innovate how we're navigating both spaces and processes. I'm very deeply committed to fostering disability confidence and creating inclusive workspaces, and that's really informed by my own lived experience and my personal journey as a late diagnosed autistic and ADHD individual. Visually, I am a white middle-aged woman, and I have long, usually wavy gray hair. It's currently braided in pigtail braids to keep it on my face. I'm short. I'm only 4'11". Not that you can tell through the video, but now you know. And I am wearing a beige collarless shirt. And that's me.
Thank you, Melanie. We'd now like to hand over to Bushra for your introduction.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bushra Hashim. I go by the pronoun she, her, elle. I am a South Asian woman of color with dark curly hair that falls down to my back. And today I'm wearing a black blazer. I am currently an adaptive design specialist at Metaphor, based out of Calgary, Alberta. I have a background in architecture and accessibility consulting that's informed by both lived and learned experience with neurodiversity. Yeah, and I'm excited to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your introduction. And Ethan, over to you.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the conversation today. My name is Ethan Pilippo. I have short brown hair. I wear glasses. Today I'm wearing a black top and I go by the pronouns he and him. I would like to bring the perspective of technical codes and the built environments development through design, and through that, the stewardship of accessibility through these processes as I work at an architecture firm as a draftsperson, architectural technologist. So the work that I do deeply influences the built environment. So to be considerate of where our codes and standards and practices drive us, and then also what we've learned beyond where these lines have been drawn. So I'm excited to contribute this way.
Thank you. And over to Lara.
Good day. I am Laura Pinchbeck. I'm joining you from Emiskwaciwâskahikan, which is colonially known as Edmonton in Alberta. I am a middle-aged woman who's middle-sized with shaggy, crazy, grayish, silveryish hair, who is originally of Northern European ancestry. And I would describe myself in terms of the work that I do. I'm a professional human ecologist. I'm a design anthropologist, so I study how design processes work so that we can have more inclusive places. And I'm also a socio-spatial researcher, so I look at evaluating the relationship that people with disabilities have to their environment. So, and I have 35 years of lived, loved, labored, and learned experience relating to neurodiversity. And if it weren't for one of my children being diagnosed, I never would have learned about an official understanding of myself. So thank you for letting me be here today.
Thanks for being here. So we're now going to just move on to some definitions around language, because we know that language can be confusing around this topic. So we're going to explain very quickly some of the language that we're going to use today. So all on the slide, there's a slide which has just appeared, and I'm going to describe this slide and what I'm saying. So all humans are part of the neurodiversity spectrum, as we all process information differently and uniquely. A neurotypical person refers to someone who thinks and processes information in ways that are typical within their culture. A neurodivergent person refers to someone whose brain processes information in a way that's not considered typical. An individual may be neurodivergent, however, a group can be referred to as neurodiverse. Very often people say, so what does the umbrella of neurodiversity undertake? And I really encourage everyone afterwards to explore this, because this list is not exhaustive, but it does include a wide range of variations. You notice I say variations and not conditions, because I don't like the medical model of disability. So variations such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, as well as epilepsy, OCD, bipolar disorder, sensory processing disorder, dementia, and this is a word that I have difficult. I can't say this word. It's where you have sensory disabilities. So this is a very good example of neurodivergence in operation. I'm dyslexic, so some words I just cannot. It's very hard for me to kind of sound out. In terms of neurodiversity, it celebrates the unique strengths and challenges of these variations, and it recognizes there is no single way for our brains to work. Amongst adults, dyslexia is one of the most common neurodivergent conditions. We're now going to move on to the questions, and these are going to appear on the next slide, which is coming. So the first question I'm going to put to Melanie, and the question says, how is our cultural perception of neurodiversity evolving, and what challenges still need to be addressed? Over to you, Melanie.
So I believe our cultural perception of neurodiversity is evolving really from viewing neurodiversity as a set of deficits to recognizing it more as natural variations in human cognition. We're seeing some of that shift being reflected in increased representation in media. So one of my favorite examples, if you like TV, is the character of Quinny on Heartbreak High, which is played by actress and neurodiversity advocate Chloe Hayden, who's absolutely fabulous. And that's a pretty true representation, which is a much better representation than some of the ones we've seen in the past. We're also seeing more inclusive educational practices and growing acceptance in the workplace, but there's definitely significant challenges. There's still a really big gap in general understanding and acceptance of neurodivergent conditions beyond the more commonly discussed and known things like autism and ADHD. So conditions like dyslexia, which was already mentioned, dyspraxia, borderline personality disorder, and Tourette syndrome, among many others, also need more recognition and more understanding. And that lack of awareness really impacts how those individuals receive support across different areas of life and across their lifespan. The implementation of accommodations in the workplace often falls short. They're seen as just ticking a box for compliance rather than really true inclusivity. And they're still very contingent on them not bringing on undue hardship on the employer, which is kind of a nebulous term. Obtaining those necessary accommodations can be a really complex process and often contingent on having an official medical diagnosis. Again, something that poses significant barriers. And that's particularly true for individuals assigned female at birth or AFAB individuals. And that's actually the fastest growing demographic that's actually being diagnosed with ADHD as well. And many in that group, alongside what they refer to as the lost generations of autistics, which is the generation I'm part of. I grew up in the 80s. Girls didn't have autism. They didn't look at women being autistic at all back in those days so much. So we've gone through a lot of periods where there's a significant chunk of the population that's just not being recognized with these conditions. And on top of that, even now, many health professionals and mental health or medical professionals lack training to identify conditions like autism or ADHD in adults, especially in AFAB individuals, because those conditions have been historically associated with children primarily. So they might be covered in something like pediatrics, but I mean, autism, where it is not, there is no psychiatric real treatment for autism, psychiatrists aren't necessarily trained on it or how to recognize it in adults. Traditionally, societies also viewed neurodivergence through the medical model of disability, which really tries to fix people, or fit people to society's norms. And it's a model that's influenced a lot of treatments, like applied behavioral analysis, which focuses on changing behaviors to match what is actually considered normal by society. And ABA has become a really major industry. It's been criticized for trying to make neurodivergent people act like everyone else, instead of supporting unique ways of being. But the social model of disability does seem to be the direction in which we're moving in. So I'm really happy about that because it supports changing society to better accommodate the different needs, not changing the person. So it situates the disability outside of the person. It's not your fault that you are experiencing this. It is society as a whole that disables and our environments as well. So it encourages creating environments that are more welcoming for everyone, like designing quieter workspaces or offering different ways to communicate. And that shift really helps move away from the idea that neurodivergent people need fixing. And it promotes more understanding and accepting view, recognizing value of everyone just as they are. And it supports practices to help neurodivergent people thrive without losing their own identity. We really need to continue educating the public, promoting neurodivergent voices, and advocating for systemic changes that will prioritize accessibility and inclusion. Embracing neurodiversity means creating environments where everyone, regardless of their neurological makeup, can thrive and contribute to their fullest potential.
Thank you, Melanie. And I'm now going to hand over to Bushra.
Thank you for that answer, Melanie. I think it's very broad and kind of provide a good overview of some of the social and cultural kind of dimensions of neurodiversity and where some of those challenges lie. I think there's not much more I can add to that, but I will speak a little bit to kind of where we're headed and how that kind of affects the design ecology and people that work in design professionals, as well as community building professionals like policies and kind of our cities and what that means. So, I mean, in terms of statistics, the most recent Canadian survey of disabilities show kind of the rise of our elderly population that, again, as you age and kind of your cognitive functions degenerate or decline, those kind of conditions, those kind of variations also kind of affect how we might design our spaces. 40% of our youth also have kind of are experiencing mental health conditions, depression, anxiety, and with neurodiversity, because of the way that these barriers still exist in terms of stigma in our societies, most people that are neurodivergent actually have comorbid conditions in terms of mental health conditions. So they will also have things like depression and anxiety, and that also just exacerbates their lived experiences. In terms of the design and how kind of challenges exist, till now, there's been a lack of kind of design guidelines that people can kind of look to and address and kind of follow when they are approaching their designing spaces, renovations, whatever that may be, whether that's residential spaces, office spaces. And so we are starting to see some of those shifts happening, but I think where some of the biggest gaps lie in that is the application of these design guidelines in projects and then the post-occupancy evaluations of those. So are we being effective? Is it like what needs to pivot, what needs to change? And that is something that we need to do with the neurodivergent community and engagement with them because of just the subjective nature of what neurodiversity is. And one thing that I will add from my perspective is also the need for intersectional advocacy. Just experience as how does neurodiversity vary as a woman? How does it vary as a woman of color? How does it vary as kind of all these different identities that add on to and further add complexity to the neurodivergent experience?
Thank you. And Ethan, over to you.
Thank you, Bushra. That was great. So how is our cultural perception of neurodiversity evolving? When I'm thinking about how it's evolving in our workplaces, I'm an RHFAC professional, so I have the opportunity to bring up accessibility to all of our clients who are interested, and many of them have piquing interest about this program. And what I see about this piqued interest is workplaces beginning to embrace individuals. And when we see individuals who are embracing their diversity and ability and then feel empowered to contribute meaningfully to their teams, they become the people who drive the shift in our cultural perceptions. To have these doors open for all people is really that shifting perceptions for all people. And where do we still need work done? we need to remind people, especially those who are decision makers, policymakers, people who are hiring, people who are in facilities management, that without opportunity, there's no space to make meaningful shifts towards equality.
Thank you, Ethan. And Lara, over to you.
Oh, thank you all. You've got me thinking about things, and I'm not going to get distracted and go on a tangent. I was thinking about how I've seen the stigma associated with, or the understanding associated with neurodiversity being accepted in our culture broadly. I think of when I was a little kid going to school, you know, the cultural, there was a cultural responsibility to teach children how to fit in, how to be ready for school, how to behave appropriately was a common phrase, you know, and every single report card that I would go back to, I would have comments about, if only she would apply herself, if only she would focus on things, you know, and there wasn't an understanding of the fact that that people have a variety of different ways of operating in some way. And that the lasting effects of that kind of repeated message impacts both an individual, but it also impacts my ability to be able to participate in a community in some way. And I think there's, as I see what's happened for my children's generation, and now there's a new generation of youngsters that are starting off school, and I think because there's at least more popular culture, popular discourse about it, even if it's not a saturated understanding of the breadth of our experiences, at least there's some curiosity about trying to understand what are assets that everybody has, rather than continuing to address their deficiencies in some way or their differences. But the other thing that I'm worried about is that I want to follow up on somebody's comment earlier about the formulation or the presentation of design guidelines. And one of the things that I know we've all experienced is that any time that we are trying to share information, that means that as individuals, we are opening ourselves up for public consumption in some way. Our private stories become you know, common knowledge. They're available now, and that puts us in a position of vulnerability. If we haven't had positive receptions to doing that in the past, we're less likely to want to present ourselves as an ally or present ourselves as a collaborator in some way to be able to do that. So it is imperative that every context in which we are both invited to, but also demanding to be participants in and to be contributors to, actually is controlled by us in some way. It's controlled by the person with the lived experience, in the sense that we need to, it's our information, it's our commodity in some way, and we need to be able to control what happens to it. Otherwise, we continue to victimize people, and if we and misinterpret people. And if we do that, then we're going to keep reinforcing the stigmas that are associated with all of us in some way. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura. It's so interesting hearing everyone's perspective of this, and I'm just sitting here nodding along, and I think this conversation has been so overdue. Moving on to question 2, and I'm going to make question 2 a little bit of a quick fire round with this one, because I really want to explore the 3rd question, and I'm conscious of our time today. So on the screen, there is a slide, and question 2 is, how does neurodivergence affect how we perceive our surroundings? Now, I know this is really not been explored to the extent that I think it needs to be. Personally, working in accessibility in the built environment, I don't think it's considered in enough detail, and there's a lack of understanding. And also I feel that there's kind of a dismissive culture to it. So I'm going to ask if this can be like a 1-minute answer with this one, just so we can explore our 3rd question. So Ethan, I'm going to hand over to you now, and then we'll go to Lara.
Okay, I'll paraphrase that. So as the work I mentioned previous, often influencing the workspaces that people inhabit every waking day that they are at work. So you get your weekends to your own space, but work is a space that you spend a lot of time. So when the design community is approaching what's popular and what seems like a great solution for efficiency in plan layouts for how many people can we fit in a floor plate, what we're doing when we're not being considerate of or mindful of those employees' experience is, again, like Laura had mentioned, possibly victimizing them by creating an environment that doesn't consider their experience a neurodivergent experience, one that needs an accommodation that might extend beyond people who would and include people who are consider themselves neurotypical in some sense. So when we're thinking about open office workspaces, we've got our low height partition walls between our workstations. We have our height adjustable desks. We have task lighting. It's opened up the door to a new level of collaboration between each other. But at the same time, when you're not in a collaborative environment or on a team that's collaborating, you might be adjacent to people who are. So what you are then perceiving are crosstalks, loud environments, distractions. And what is difficult for some people is to resist the urge to contribute or to remain focused on their work or to be able to hear a colleague who's sitting next to you even. So it's creating problems while also enabling collaboration. So we just really need to be mindful about what else can we provide. Are there other approaches that we can take? Are there spaces that can be made adjacent to these open spaces so that individuals can find reprieve or the ability to focus? So it's really about making conscious thought about what would enable any employee to find success and find productivity in their day so that they can have a fulfilling day at work.
Thanks, Ethan. Over to Lara.
This is so important for us to think about because we don't really understand yet as designers all the different ways that brains can function. And I think there's a lot of assumptions that are done that we approach things in a common way and we generalize how to do it. So for example, yesterday I was in a restaurant and one of the things that always happens to me is I'm expected to choose something off of a menu. I don't make decisions in the way that menu planners are assuming that I will decide something. And so it doesn't matter if I'm, shopping for a product or clothes, or I'm trying to figure out where to go or whatever, I end up with decision paralysis. And I want the world to change how it presents information to me so that I can go through a hierarchy of yes, no's to figure out what I want to end up with as a final decision. I'm expected to keep too much information about all of those different meal choices in my head and then sort them out, and it's overwhelming in that of itself. Then if I'm in an environment where I'm bombarded with multisensorial information that I have no control over, especially if it's not a familiar context, it's too much for me to decide and to be able to filter and keep track of all of that information that's in there. And I think that we're starting to open up the conversation about making sure that we take all of that multisensorial information and it's all coordinated to make sure that it reinforces the same message all the time. Otherwise, if there's contradictory information, not only does it negate itself, but it actually can pollute that ability to be able to process what we need to for that context.
Thank you. And again, I was just nodding along. So many of those things really resonate with myself. Bushra, over to you.
I think the one thing I will say in my 1 minute about how neurodiversity influences our experiences is differently. We all process our environments differently, and that just has to do with our sensory interactions. That's how we receive information from our environments, and that's how we understand and interpret it internally. And when it comes to the design of our spaces, we approach accessibility through standards and legislation, which is important for people to understand. It's important in terms of making that a mandatory aspect, but there is no standard way of experiencing our environment. So that makes it difficult when it comes to neurodiversity. There's also kind of a focus on the visual dimensions, kind of our visual sense when it comes to design of our environments, but we really kind of have to understand it more holistically. How do environments affect us in terms of our cognition? How do they affect us in terms of our senses? And approach design in a way that takes into consideration some of the more sensory dimensions that come with tactile senses or auditory senses. And even to some degree, our sense of smell. Yeah, so I guess I would say there is no typical way. And so we have to be mindful that we are considering a variety of different ways of experiencing our environments.
Absolutely, thank you. Your comment around the holistic approach that you must take, it's so valid. And Melanie, I'd like to now hand over to you.
Yeah, so as somebody, I mean, I'm going to echo a lot of what's already been said, but as somebody who's both autistic and has ADHD, I can really tell you the traditional office environments feel like navigating an obstacle course designed for somebody else's brain. Fluorescent lighting, ambient noise, visual clutter, it's just a lot of stuff to trigger me sensorily. And it makes it really challenging to focus, which can even lead to emotional distress. All distractions in an open plan office are amplified and it's impossible to block out. And another part of that is the concept of universal design, which is sort of an idealistic term. And while it's well-intentioned, it often kind of falls short for neurodivergent people because it often prioritizes that physical accessibility, though it is moving a little bit more into education now. But often it does overlook sensory and cognitive needs, which are really important for our well-being and productivity, which is why myself and others like me thrive in environments that tend to allow for more flexibility and control over our surroundings, like working from home. And the benefits of allowing that, there's a huge business case to be made for that. It reduces absenteeism, it reduces costs related to medical leave, it reduces turnover, increases loyalty. There's a strong business case to making all these changes and being more inclusive.
Thank you. We're now going to move over to our last question here, and it's going to appear on the screen, but I'm going to read it as well. So this is question 3, and it says, what are some steps that individuals can take to create more welcoming communities for neurodivergent individuals? So I'd like to start by handing over to Bushra.
Thank you. I think for me, there are 2 parts to this. You can't build a community without understanding who's in it. So the education and training and awareness of the types of neurodivergent experiences, awareness training for businesses, schools, community groups. That's kind of the first part about how understanding neurodiversity better and learning how to support individuals more effectively. And the second part is that while belief, knowledge, kind of understanding attitude, like the different attitudes and the stigmas and legal mandates are the first step, they're not enough to kind of move the needle. Removing barriers has to be about the practice of building habits and building capacity and building behavioral skills, so communication skills. How do we communicate with diverse neurological experiences? How does teamwork look like that? How, within that, how does adaptability look within that? So for example, if you're involved in design or architecture, like myself, you can consider how your work can accommodate diverse cognitive and sensory needs along with physical needs. One of the ways that I like to think about it is to provide variety, choice, and control. So that's simple changes like quieter spaces in public areas or offices. I join you here today from the Zen room of the office that I work at. There's also things like providing sensory-friendly shopping hours. That's where a lot of people who are neurodivergent, as well as our elderly populations, go during those kind of allocated quiet hours. things like adjustable lighting, noise control features, scent-free policies, and clear signage can also significantly improve the environments and what some individuals can take within their own personal spaces, as well as kind of collectively within their communities.
Thank you. And Melanie, if you'd like to continue the conversation.
Yeah, I'm going to focus in on that, being able to customize your experience. So things like dimmable lighting, things like adjustable heating, those are things that don't just benefit those who are neurodivergent. It can benefit everyone, including owners of businesses, because it can also even reduce costs related to things like electricity. So it makes business sense to bring these things in, and there definitely has to be a consultation process in there. Neurodivergent folks must be considered, must be spoken with. That whole nothing about us without us is so critical to being able to create spaces that will be really welcoming and comfortable. And we need to include everybody in that. And the only way to really create inclusive spaces is to make them customizable, because there's no one space that is going to work for anyone. So it's figuring out, getting creative with adjustments, I think is really important.
Thank you. And Lara, over to you now.
Sorry, I apologize for wiggling. I'm getting nervous, and I usually walk all day. So I think it's interesting that a lot of our conversations so far has been talking about design as a noun, as a product, as an end result, and that ends up focusing a lot on the place or the space that we're there. But I also want to throw in the idea that design is a verb. So it's the process by which we are going through and arriving at the final, whatever it is, what final product. It could be a program, a piece of equipment, or a place in some way. And one of the things that I'm aware of is that whether it's engagement activities or even evaluation activities later on, those tend to be pushed on to users or participants in some way to say, this is what we've decided, this is the schedule and the program and how it's going to happen. And you can, if you're able to attend and appear and participate, that's great. But I keep wondering how many people we're missing as a result of that process, and therefore how many stories become invisible and forgotten. I need the processes to be reflective of the fact that I can share information when I'm ready, and that I want to be able to have a variety of different ways of being able to share that information with you. I want to know that I can do it in a way that is going to be non-judgmental. And if I'm not ready to do it at this particular moment, don't judge me for the fact that I might not be sorted, or I might not have the energy to do it, or I might feel fragile and I might not be in a place where I can do it. Or I might be really angry because I've experienced something else that just feels like yet another barrier, a social barrier that we've had, that I just feel like I can't put myself out there again. So in a world that, when we think of the development and the operation of built environments, it's a world that is very prescribed, it's very structured. And there's such a push, thinking of a project management lens, there's such a push to have it be as prescriptive and formulaic as possible, that there isn't that space for disabled time in some way to be able to accommodate that. And I think that means we're not being able to participate in some way, and I hope that can shift in some regard.
Thank you, Laura. And Ethan, over to you now.
Thank you. What I'm thinking about for steps that individuals can take to create a more welcoming community for neurodivergent individuals would mean that all people need to hold an open mind to other people's experiences without any of their previous held beliefs, whether they're antiquated, correct, or not. Some people have made assumptions what it means to be neurodivergent, and that itself is a barrier that we all need to overcome. And through conversations like this, we can start shifting those perspectives of individuals to be more open, more considerate, and enable people to feel more confident to ask for meaningful accommodations that enable them. And when we're thinking about what that might mean in the future, that could come through workplace policies, developed code standards. We need to be all building communities that uplift people and enable them to participate so that they do, in fact, belong and feel like they've contributed meaningfully. It's so important. As someone who works with technical documents and have for over 10 years, when I went through the Rick Hansen Foundation Professionals Program, it was a groundbreaking moment for me because I deeply understood at the end of the process what the technical requirements were actually accomplishing for the individuals of any of the accommodations that are provided through our code standards, our national building code, to actually understand the meaning of why we're providing the grab bars and the orientations that we're providing, why automatic light switches or light switches within certain ranges of reach are important. Those are just low-hanging fruit, but there's so many things that are defined in our technical world that technologists, designers, architects implement because we're told it's the minimum. Understanding the true benefit and the practical use of these pieces humanizes it, and for me, shifted that perspective forever, and has made me really passionate about making sure that we're following through and doing better than the minimum, if not always embracing the revised codes and standards so that our built environment, the one that could be the very first thing that you ever experience in life, makes you feel like you belong from day one.
Thank you for sharing those pieces. I think that kind of wrapping up, one of the things that I would like to kind of offer around that is, and it's been touched on by everyone, but is systemic policies and administrative policies, and they're not always thought through. Sometimes there are policies in place, and I understand why they're in place. However, we have to understand that first and foremost, the organization is powered, so to speak, by the people. And if you're not taking into consideration how different things work for different people, and I've had a lot of examples where there's been systemic barriers and it's been procedural, and I've had to justify why it is, and to justify it to people who I should not, absolutely not be justifying it to. And it's been escalated through the organization. And it brings about shame, and it brings about that feeling of, well, maybe I'm not capable of my job. And I'm only talking about me personally, I'm not talking about anyone else here. And that is something that I've faced a lot through that. And I think another thing as well that I would add to this is that empathy style. I've been very open that I'm neurodivergent, and sometimes I think it's been accepted by my employer and understood, but only when it suits them. And sometimes there was one exact phrase, and they said, "You're a leader, you should have told me." Well, I would flip it. You should have created a safe space for me to ask one of those questions. And the reason why I didn't ask it was because you're placing judgment. So wrapping those bits up, I'm conscious of the time here. So we're going to answer just one of the questions, and the rest will be answered by email. And again, if we could just please do a quick fire on this one, just so we can wrap up. This question is, and for the participants, please raise your hand who'd like to answer it, and I'll go in that order. Can you give any good examples? Let's do a good news story now. Can you give examples of organizations who are doing a really good job of creating welcoming environments for neurodivergent folks? And I think I'll just start with this in saying there is such a wealth of new neurodivergent policies for hiring and things out there. One thing that I would say particularly where I've seen a lot of it around, and I'm really happy for this, it being embraced is among the consultancies. So I'm not going to name all of them individually because a lot of them do have their own policies, but it's great that they have seen the value. So I'm just going to pause for a second and see who would like to take this question first. So the reminder is what organizations are doing a good job of this? And I think while we wait to think about this is really telling in itself in terms of when we have to kind of pause to think about, who's doing a good job around this. Melanie, I see your hand up. Go ahead, and then
sorry about that. I started off. So I had some colleagues that were in Ottawa last year, I guess, and visited Accessibility Standards head offices in Ottawa, which apparently are amazing and lovely and have a lot of customizable features like lighting and are just very, very well thought out for neurodivergent folks. Unfortunately, first so I don't know how the rest of the day unrolled, and I have not seen the offices personally, but my colleagues were very, very impressed by what had been done there.
Thank you, Melanie. And Ethan, over to you.
I think that an organization that's doing a good job is one that's listening, one that's holding space and enabling their employees. So I don't know if we could pick any one, because any organization is capable of making this change and becoming a leader. It's really about shifting perspectives, revising your policies, consulting with organizations that are knowledgeable so that you can at least have a head start, and always be willing to revise and do better. And through revisions and the intention to do better, you do create better spaces, but you always have to consult, be open-minded, and enable people to contribute.
Thank you. And Lara, I'll let you have the last say on this, and then we're going to go on to closing remarks. Over to you.
Thanks. I want to make the parallel with the evolution of queer rights in Canada, in that, the generation ahead of me had to fight, and they had to push themselves and demand to be able to be even seen as human. Now we see and as it's transpired through a couple of generations, the assumption is for younger folks that this is what's normal. Like it shouldn't even be a question. It should be available. And I think the same conversation is happening for folks with invisible disabilities, in the sense that we started off life saying, hang on a second, like why? Okay, I have to ask for something. But now they're starting to advocate for the fact that they should be able to be full participants in society in some way, and that they shouldn't have to ask for anything else, and that systems should be in place. So when you're asking the organization, I want to say it's actually this whole generation of confident youngsters that are growing up that are saying, actually, this is what I need in order to be the full me. Whereas they don't try to make do, where I think the rest of us tried to make do in some regard. In order for us to be able to keep reinforcing that, I think we need to constantly ask the questions of, well, who's missing? Are the people that I'm expecting to be around the table, at the table, are they giving their perspective? And that every time that we're working with anybody, especially our design colleagues who are so entrenched in assumptions and generalizations, we keep asking the 5 whys. Okay, why do you think that this is what I need? Why do you, where's that coming from? And it helps them unpack a little bit their own positionality and their own biases. And hopefully it helps to shift them so that they stop pushing their design ideas on our lives, and they start listening to the fact that we actually need what we need in order to be awesome people.
Thank you. That was such a great comment. So now, before I kind of wrap up, I'm going to invite everyone to share one really quick final takeaway. It can be anything that we've spoken about today for our audience. So I know people will probably want to reflect on this, so I'm going to let people raise their hands as we do. So if you want to take a little bit more of a moment, I'm very happy to do my closing remarks, and then we can do these bits at the end. Does that sound better? Okay, I'm going to do that bit. So while the panelists have time to reflect, and again, this is a real life example of do what's works for people. I don't like being put on the spot. I really don't, because I don't come up with the best answers, and I don't like it. It feels confrontational. So this is a great learning here, and I guess that's my takeaway. So today we've had such a great discussion. It's been a discussion which is long overdue, and I've really enjoyed so much, one, sharing this discussion, but also two, talking to other people within my community who face similar barriers, some of them different barriers, but hearing that lived experience is so valid. So in terms of kind of wrapping up these pieces, and the final remarks will also be included on the email, but neurodiversity encompasses a range of different considerations, and we spoke about those. And we know how we should be moving away from the medical mode of disability. I mean, even when I was at school, it was still treated as an illness. I mean, it just blows my mind. It really does. We need to have increased media representation, and it needs to be genuine representation, not kind of tokenism. And educational practices are there, and they're helping to shift cultural perceptions of neurodiversity, but there's a significant gap in understanding and support around neurodivergent considerations beyond the common ones that we know about. And I think the lack of awareness supports across the lifespan, and it kind of perpetuates this whole need of even asking for a workplace accommodation. Like, why should it be a workplace accommodation? It's the way a person works. People have different styles. We have different preferences. And I think finally, around kind of design, we need to be more mindful. People need to be included from the get-go. And we need to understand about, while there can be perceptions around, oh, co-working and have open spaces, these can be real barriers to people. And actually, sometimes people can have that barrier means that they don't present their best work or bring their best self to work. And creating welcoming communities for neurodivergent individuals requires more education, more awareness, and the inclusion. And enough with the shame is what I say. So I'm just looking at the hands up. Bashra, your hand is up first. So we have got about 3 minutes. So Bashra, over to you with your quick takeaway.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think just speaking to the previous question about how organization can successfully implement neurodiversity, and this is something that applies to your social environments, your cultural environments, and your physical environments, that it's not only about what people know, but what they do and how easy it is for them to do it. And this isn't something that applies just to the neurodivergent community. This is all of us. This is something that is important to all of us. So that's kind of my final takeaway for today.
Thank you. My apologies. I can't find the order of the hands, but everyone has their hands up. So I'm going to do the order of my screen. So Laura, over to you.
Sure. I want to commend organizations or even people that are stumbling along and they're open to having conversations where they're first aware that they might not have all the answers and that they're hoping to be able to incorporate more information. Because even if they're not getting it right, they're open to evolving in some way. And that's a first step towards developing a context in which they're showing all of us that we can actually make a social space, a space in our culture where all of us belong and we're not being othered.
Thank you. Melanie, over to you.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about environments and design, and I think it's also important to think about the way we design employment, our workday, our work week, social supports, accommodations, academia, and just all accessibility programs and policies, and make sure that accessibility is built in and inclusive from the start. And if we need to revisit things and modify things, then we should be doing it now. because we are being called to make our society and our country much more accessible than it is currently. And if we don't do it now, it's later going to become an obligation, whether we want to do it or not, for many of the proposed changes that will be coming. So if you can get ahead of it, learn about it, educate, take all the training that you can, speak to people that are willing to talk about their lived experience, include all of us, ask questions. I know I love giving input, love being included. I want my voice to be heard. But there has to be a balance. Of course, you don't want to also ask disabled folks to do all the work for you. Just step carefully and be ambitious. Be enthusiastic about the changes. Think big. Would be
Thank you.
big.
Thank you, Melanie. And I'm going to be cheeky and add one thing off, and pay people for their input. It's not just about volunteering. Pay people what people are worth if they are giving you insights. So that's my final piece, but Ethan, over to you, and then I'm going to wrap up after that.
All right. So I guess this isn't really a key takeaway. It was just something that I wanted to say to those who are listening to this webinar, that if you've just begun your journey in understanding yourself in a deeper way, or if you've got concerns regarding your abilities, if you do feel or believe that you're part of a neurodivergent category person experience, that you shouldn't let yourself be defined by the negative connotations of our past, that the future's a lot different, that you should be gentle with yourself and find and celebrate your abilities, because there's more than several of those for every single person. And what you really should be doing is feeling empowered by the knowledge, and celebrate that you understand who you are and that you can still contribute meaningfully.
Thank you, Ethan. And I'm aware that we're at the top of the hour, so some people will be leaving, but this is recorded. So I'm just going to talk about our final pieces. So I want to thank the panelists so much for all of their insights in this really meaningful conversation. One of my friends uses the word, it fills my cup, and this absolutely fills my cup, these conversations. Also, thank you to the Rick Hansen Foundation for bringing us together to discuss this important topic in honor of National Accessibility Week. There are events throughout the week, so I really encourage you to check those out. And as you know, the Rick Hansen Foundation is a national registered charity. If you'd like help to support the foundation in putting on more educational events like this in the future, you can donate at their website, rickhansen.com/donate. Your support helps remove physical, attitudinal barriers to accessibility and creates a Canada for everyone, everywhere. After this webinar, a short survey will be emailed to you following the event. You can also access it. There is a QR code which has appeared on the screen, and the information on the screen I'm also reading out. The panel recording and recap blog will be emailed out to everyone who registered for this event. You should expect this in your inbox in the coming 2 weeks. And my parting comment is, do this because it's legislation. Do this because the standards say so. Do this because you want to feel like you're a great person. Do it because you are a great person. Just do it. Just do this inclusion. Thank you so much for your time today. And once again, thanks to the panelists. And this concludes our session.